Today's episode was recorded live at the Forum Theater on Columbia University's campus as part of New York City Climate Week on September 26, 2025. You can watch the video versions of this and past episodes at our website, singforscience.org. Please be sure to check out our other episodes, including a conversation with Questlove on developmental psychology. Don't forget to click subscribe, and please rate the show on your favorite podcast platform.
What's interesting about the word inertia or the concept of inertia is that it really does mean two things, right? That an object at rest stays at rest. But the other part of inertia is that an object in motion stays in motion. And so, let's go all in on that piece of it, right? Because as long as we keep going in motion, we can stay in motion.
I was gonna save the planet, but today I got plans. I guess this is just what I am. I'm an object in motion. I'm lost on emotion. My two legs are broken, but look at me dance. Oh, inertia.
Welcome to Sing for Science, the show where musicians and scientists talk about music and science. I'm your host, Matt White. Each week, we'll talk about a song by our guest artist and how it connects with our guest scientist's area of expertise. Today, we'll be speaking with AJR band member, brother, and co-founder Adam Met. In recent years, while AJR was selling out arenas and becoming a household name, Adam earned his PhD and began teaching sustainability and climate policy at Columbia University. When discussing climate advocacy, Adam often references the band's hit Inertia, which playfully exposes the challenge of apathy and distraction with lyrics like, "I was gonna save the planet, but today I got plans." Adam is also the founder of the nonprofit Planet Reimagined and author of the best-selling activism playbook Amplify: How to Use the Power of Connection to Engage, Take Action, and Build a Better World. Also joining us is Dean of the Columbia Climate School and pioneering mechanical engineer, Dr. Alexis Abramson. Alexis is an expert in sustainable technology and building efficiency, contributing to advances in the design of next-generation materials and the energy performance of entire cities. As a mechanical engineer, her research is focused on confronting the imperative of energy conservation in thermal transport, from the smallest nanostructures to large-scale building projects. And as dean, Dr. Abramson leads the world's first comprehensive climate school, integrating disciplines from public health to finance, ecology, and beyond. The title of today's episode on the podcast is Inertia: Accelerating the Climate Movement with Imagination and in Hope. Columbia University, please help me welcome Adam Met and Alexis Abramson.
What's up, everyone?
I'd like to start with a brief discussion of the protest song.
Let's do it.
In my experience, when listening to protest music, I often find I'm on the receiving end of a healthy dose of, if not outright threat, at least moral indictment. You know? And I've put together, for the sake of argument, a brief list of examples here. Bob Dylan, he said, "And you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing." Mm-hmm. Didn't make me feel great. The Clash, "The ice age is coming, the sun zooming in, London's drowning, and I live by the river." Billie Eilish, "Man is such a fool, why are we saving him?" I found, as a child, most of the Nirvana catalog had that effect on me.
Fair.
Yet you guys come along with a biting lyric like, "I was going to save the planet, but today I got plans," and somehow I feel my spirits are lifted.
Oh,
So
wow.
I want to know how you did it.
How did we do it? It needs a little bit of context. So in the 1970s, actually in 1970 itself, 20% of the Billboard Hot 100 was protest music. Protest music by the definition that you would have used to describe the Bob Dylan song, right? Phil Oakes, does anyone know who Phil Oakes is? Okay, good. Like 3 people. he wrote a lot of protest music, kind of went even farther than Bob Dylan. I won't go into all the details about him, but the songs themselves in 1970 were protest songs, the entirety of the song. There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of projection, kind of asking people to do certain things, and that's what gave you that feeling, that, being told what to do, that we need to stand up and fight. Now, by that definition, there's no protest music on the Billboard Hot 100. It's down to 0 songs that are protest songs. However, the argument could be made, and I tend to make this argument a lot, that there's still about 20% of the Billboard Hot 100 that is protest music. But because of the way algorithms work and the way people discover music and get excited about artists, the idea of protest is embedded in the song as just a normalized part of how people go about their day. And so it's not asking people to do anything, it's talking to them about how issues in the world make them feel, and then that ends up instigating protest in people's own lives. So the Billie Eilish example you gave is great. Our song, Inertia, I was going to save the planet, but today I've got plans. That's exactly that. Lizzo does this around body image. Megan Thee Stallion does this around mental health. The songs aren't about that topic, but they just embed these issues in 1 or 2 lines because it's the things that people are feeling. It's normalizing the idea of talking about issues in entertainment. And we're seeing this in films and TV and other places too. You don't need to make the whole thing about something that people are angry or frustrated about, but it is important to recognize because it's a part of normal life.
That is really, it's encouraging, and so much of this comes out in the book. Another point that is, I think, relevant is, I think it was in this, there's a storytelling chapter, or there's a chapter where I think you talk about a collaboration with Ticketmaster where you surveyed fans.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So,
and actually, let's give a little bit of primer about what this book is about.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book is called Amplify. It came out in June. And it was the product of me doing so many meet and greets while I was on tour, and fans coming up to me and saying, "What can I do?" And when you have 30 seconds or a minute with a fan, it's so hard to communicate, how they can actually make a difference. And this would happen over and over and over again in every city across the world. People would ask this question. So I wrote this book, and the book is about how we can take the strategies from the music industry and the entertainment industry. The deep strategy is about building fan bases and how we can apply them to build better social movements. Yes, I look at climate primarily because that's where I live, that's the work that I do, but I also look at guns, LGBTQ rights, immigration, healthcare, etc. And one of the things that we've done on tour as part of so I run an organization called Planet Reimagined that does a lot of research and advocacy in the climate space. One of the projects that we've incubated is based on this theory that the music space, the sports space, where people gather in person, there is this opportunity for advocacy to explode, especially civic and political advocacy. The original town square, right, in the 1800s is where people got together to do things, to talk, to hear music, etc. That's where civic dialogue and political participation happened. Let's bring that back. In person is growing like crazy. Live Nation invested $1 billion in new venues in small towns in America in June, and they sold 250 million tickets in 2024. 250 million tickets. That's where people are meeting in person. In person is back. Digital is now the most effective tool of moving people in person. Think about that for a second, especially with the distrust around AI, right? With the distrust around misinformation. People are using digital to get people in person. But to actually answer your question, we did a study with Ticketmaster to try and figure out, okay, if we are bringing people in person, what are the things we can do when they are in person? What are the actions they're willing to take around civic and political, duty? So we did a massive study. We sent a poll out to about 350,000 people. Ticketmaster helped us with this to understand what these actions are that people are willing to take. We measured everything from when they want to take these actions, what they're willing to do, are they willing to do it with friends? The results of this study were insane, like nothing we had seen before. people want to be taking action when, here's a couple of kind of top line results. People want to be taking action when the artist not just asks them to do it, but says, I'm doing this, will you join me? That subtle language makes a huge difference in whether people are willing to take action or not. And to be clear, I'm not talking about any of the straw bullshit, like switching to paper straws from plastic straws or pledging to go vegan one meal a week, none of that. This is all real concrete stuff. This is, yes, registering to vote, but even more than that, we had phone banking on site. People were calling their representatives, asking them to vote on certain issues locally based on the different issues in that city. Every single city had a different customized action. In Phoenix, we pulled in, it was 109 degrees. We had a petition that people were signing to get FEMA to designate extreme heat as an emergency because that was personal to them. When you make it personal and you make it concrete and the artist is engaged asking people to participate, we saw about 15% of people who walked through the door to our tour last year take action. Now, 15% doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is a huge amount when you think that they're not there for that. They're there to be entertained and see a show. We just built this into the Billie Eilish.
It's a huge amount when you're playing 2 nights at Madison Square Garden.
Fair. We did it with Billie Eilish and her 13 shows in the UK this summer. This week, we're building it into the Tyler Childers tour, country artists. We wanted to reach a completely different audience. And we just got approval to put on the Lorde tour and the Renee Rapp tour. So we're now building this out across the world. We're doing it in Australia, too. The Australia Institute replicated our study to make sure it can be done there. Everything I do is academic, really research-based, and then as quickly as possible, because, as Alexis knows, the climate crisis needs to be addressed right now. And so everything we do is how can we implement it as quickly as possible.
And one of the things that I've also heard you talk about is how when you're touring and you're engaging directly with students on college campuses, how often you'll be met with this idea that people don't feel like that they can contribute because they're doing something unrelated. They're studying poli-sci, they're pre-med, and you correct that and say, no, climate is related to all of these things. And I think this is a great opportunity for you and Alexis to chat about how you're meeting those challenges head on in the different ways, because this is the first truly comprehensive climate school in the world. And I bring up this slide that you often reference as a good entry point, because I find this extremely meaningful. Ayanna Johnson is such a great thought leader.
Yep.
And the way that this is framed as this is how you avoid burnout, not this is how you change the world, but this is also that seems to be one of the key points.
The inertia issue.
Yes, please.
I'm just saying that avoiding burnout has a lot to do with inertia.
100%.
Yeah.
So do you want to say anything about this before?
Sure. So Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, if you don't know who she is, an incredible scientist. She's written a couple of books. I would go check her out, just a real badass. Am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
100%.
Okay, great. Thank you. I should have asked that before in the green room, but what the fuck?
Or before you curse.
Exactly. Let's talk about this for just a second. So the work that needs doing, obviously, that's pretty self-explanatory. There's a tremendous amount in the climate movement that needs to be done. People are studying all of these different topics. What brings you joy, also pretty self-explanatory. And this is one of the reasons why I like this, is because it's really easy to answer these questions. But I have a fourth category to this that I think is really important and that will do even more to help avoid burnout, is what actually can be done and what can be done quickly. So for me, local is king, especially in this current political environment in the US. There is so much that's happening at the city level and at the state level that is flying. It's moving faster than anything we've ever seen before. One of the things that causes burnout is when people work on something for a really, really long time and don't see results. But at the city level and the state level, you can find wins so much faster. So when I talk to people all the time about getting engaged, I always say the first thing that you should do is something that is achievable quickly. Don't join a campaign that's a 20-year campaign to try and end all PFAS, right? That's really important, and that's something that people should work on. But I would say if there's like a very specific zoning issue in one neighborhood that will take a certain amount of signatures in order to get passed by the city council, do something like that, right? It's something where you can have a win for yourself, you can hang your hat on, and it's much less likely that you're going to burn out if you have those like joyous wins within you. So I would add that as a fourth category.
Okay. You got to get the universe to throw you a bone every once in a while to keep fuel in the tank.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the climate school and specifically about some of these different areas of study that students are pursuing and how that can be applied to climate work.
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in here. And I do want to say, as a scientist engineer, having a song about physics, like at least with that title, even if it's sort of, loosely, if you will, woven in, it's just sort of warms my heart a bit. So thank you for that. And just if I can do a little bit on that what's interesting about the word inertia or the concept of inertia is that it really does mean two things, right? That an object at rest stays at rest. And that idea that I was going to save the planet, but today I got plans, right? How do I motivate to do that? How do I find joy? How do I not burn out? But the other part of inertia is that an object in motion stays in motion. And so, let's go all in on that piece of it, right? Because as a social movement, as a climate school, in all the things that I know the students in the audience in particular are working on, right? We keep working on it, of course. We do have to worry about burnout and think about what we're working on and achieving things, but I think as long as we keep going in motion, we can stay in motion. So I just wanted to give a nod to that.
Thank you.
In terms of this complex problem of climate change, right, I think we've been trying to solve this problem for decades now, and we've had scientists and engineers, we've had policymakers, some business people, venture capital investors. We've looked at it from a human health standpoint. We've had journalists, right? We have all these people in these various disciplines working on how do I mitigate climate change, right? How do I communicate about climate change? How do I deal with the effects of climate change? And I think one of the things that we found is that when you're working on it sort of in isolation, focused on one discipline, you're just not going to achieve what you need to achieve. So take the solar industry, right? Solar panels have been around since the 1970s. Some could argue earlier than that, right? The costs have come down. Policies have been put in place, right? Financing has become available. We've looked at how to put solar panels in various parts of the globe, how to educate consumers about this. It's taken decades. This is a really hard problem. And what we argue at the climate school is we've run out of time for decades. And so it's really important that in the academic programs that we do, the research that we do, the impact work that we do, that everybody is thinking in a multidisciplinary way. That the scientist who's building a battery is thinking about the potential sustainability impact of the materials that might be mined for that battery early on, not later on, 10 years from now. That they're thinking about the costs. They're running what's called a techno-economic analysis on that battery early. Because why should we be doing research on that battery if it's going to cost 50x what the batteries we need cost, right? So how do we get that business, policy, human health, sustainability, science and engineering in early? And that's our approach at the climate school, is that our academic programs and our research that we're doing are almost always exclusively multidisciplinary in that way.
So give me some examples about specific courses that you're teaching.
So in an applied climate class that we take and that we teach, I should say we have 3 master's programs, 2 that just launched this fall, a master's of arts in climate and society, a master of science in climate, and a master of science in climate finance. So already you see sort of the breadth there. We require 4 core courses on the topic of climate as it pertains to various aspects. Some is a little more societal leaning, some a little more technical. But in one of our courses, Applied Climate, right, we're actually looking at, okay, what are the solutions that are out there? And again, solutions, I'm not just talking about the technologies, right? What are the policy solutions, right? What are the technology solutions? What are the financial mechanisms to actually get the financing to developing countries, for example, to help them put renewables on the grid, right? All of that looked at in that single course. And then also part of that course is communications, right? We want our students to also getting things out there into the world requires knowing how to communicate about that. So bringing communications into the course, not just this add-on you might do, right, as a workshop, right, but into the course is incredibly important. Because if you can't communicate about the work that you're doing, you're probably not going to be as successful in trying to make that kind of change.
So on that front, when you're teaching communication, how do you teach navigation of conflict?
Very challenging, especially today. I think it's a muscle that we haven't exercised a lot in society more recently. This idea that having a conversation with somebody you disagree with is actually a very constructive thing. It helps inform you what other people are thinking, and helps you gain a different perspective on your own ideas as well. And so it's something that I like to build up. We've been having lots of conversations about how we're going to build that muscle even more at the climate school. But having our students actually practice in dialogue. Dialogue means having a conversation. It doesn't mean convincing the other person. I think a lot of people enter into these discussions thinking their job is to convince the other person, and that's not necessarily the most constructive approach. So it's, how do I have a dialogue with somebody who disagrees with me in a respectful, constructive way? And it may be 2 weeks from now that person kind of has processed what you thought, and maybe they start thinking differently, looking at the world a little bit differently. But so it's that idea of what does it mean to have a dialogue, and how to do that to have the greatest impact.
Could we get into this a little?
Please.
Do you mind if I get comfortable? I'm
Yeah.
taking off my shoes. It's time. Let's go. Okay. All right. So let's talk about how we talk about climate, because in reality, we fucked up. We, meaning everybody in this. How many of you are like in the climate movement? Would consider yourself part of the climate movement?
I think it's probably
Okay,
everybody.
great. Amazing. So we fucked up over the last 15 years or so, but a lot in the last 2.5 years. Do you know why? It's because we used a lexicon, we used a language that nobody else understands except the people who are already in this room and the people who are already attending places like Climate Week. If you go to another country that doesn't speak English, why would you be screaming at them in English? It doesn't make any sense, right? So we developed a set of terms, even the phrase climate change, sustainability, even something like environmental justice. All of these concepts are vital, and we need to be addressing them and working on them, but that language only makes sense in these rooms. When I was on the Harris campaign, I was out door knocking and doing a lot of this kind of door-to-door. I was on college campuses talking to people. And one of the things that I found over and over again was that nobody cared about climate change. Nobody cared about 1.5 degrees. Nobody cared about sustainability. Nobody cared about any of these things. They cared about how they were going to get their kids to and from school. They cared about the food that was going to end up on their kids' plates. They cared about their jobs. They cared about economics, not in the broad sense, but how they were going to pay bills. That's what people care about. It would be so easy for all of us to reframe every single thing that we are talking about in climate in terms of how it's going to impact people. In a place like the climate school and in universities around the world, of course we should keep using this language. But I'm going to talk about that in more detail in 1 second. If we are trying to grow this movement at all, if we are trying to get Republicans and Democrats to work together, if we're trying to get, farmers and construction workers to work together on this, we need to have a different language that we're using. And for the last handful of months, my team and I have been working on this thing that we call the Neo-Industrial Revolution, which is essentially a brand new lexicon of how to talk about climate. And in this little book, and we have them for free for everybody who's here, and if you're listening to this, you can go to neoindustrialrevolution.org. It literally breaks down by sector. We talk about universities, big greens, activists, the finance sector, philanthropy, companies, the culture sector, how all of those spaces can adopt a new lexicon and reframe everything they're doing from individual action to collective action. And we can get into that in a little bit, but I want to talk about the internal lexicon for a second, because this is super relevant to the climate school and something Alexis said, and to kind of all of these different places that have cross-disciplinary work, which is so vital. That's where the future of the university is this cross-disciplinary work. When I was in school here as an undergrad, everything that we were doing in each of the different departments, nobody was talking to each other. Therefore, the platforms on which data was gathered, the people who were working on those two various platforms, were never able to actually share their data because of the literal platforms that the data was collected on. Yesterday, I was talking to a farmer, and he was telling me that he does soil science work, and the data he collects with soil science, he's literally not able to share with other farmers because the weather data that these farmers are using is on a completely different platform. It would be vital for them to be able to share this data. Even within climate work itself, we are not speaking the same language. So I think one of the key things here about the climate school here and other universities, as we're doing this research, it needs to be done with an eye towards not just how we can implement it, but who are the people who are going to be using it. There are so many incentives in academia for publish, let's get tenure, that kind of thing. The incentives need to be built around how can we implement. Now, it's not to say research for research's sake isn't vital. We absolutely need that. I mean, how else would we have had the mRNA research in order to create the COVID vaccines? But we need this framing around research in the academic space that Alexis is talking about, that really focuses on bridging all of these different fields, and how can we take research, and this is a concept that we call re-research, how can we take research that's been done over the last 20, 30, 40 years, bring that back, that's been sitting on a shelf, bring that back and use those solutions to implement now. So a lot more to talk about, but that's just the beginning of it.
I often refer to this is the decade of implementation.
Agreed.
Right? So we do have the solutions to remedy this crisis in large part. We're having trouble implementing them for a whole slew of reasons. I totally agree with Adam. I think, and in that language reframing, I think sort of two aspects of the reframing of it, like that energy brings quality of life to people across the globe. We're not trying to deny anybody access to energy. It brings quality of life, it brings security. Renewable and clean energy even goes beyond that, right? And so how do we do that? How do we implement these solutions across the globe so that we're enhancing the quality of life of everybody? And then the other part of the communication I think too we have to work on is, I think we still are thinking, this is all like doom scrolling, like, 1.5 degrees. We're trying not to get above 1.5 degrees.
We don't even use Celsius in the United States.
2.2 Fahrenheit, is that okay? And yet at the same time, as Adam pointed out, particularly at the local level and the state level, we're doing such amazing work that actually when the Paris Climate Accords were signed, there were models that predicted we were getting to 4 degrees. And now actually we run similar models, we're at 2.7, not great, but it's not 4. We've actually made progress. If you look at the state of California was 219 days in the year 2024 where they were running on 100% renewables for some portion of the day. Amazing. That's amazing progress that was made. And we're not spending enough time. And that might be a little more in the circle with people who know us, right?
Yeah.
But even within that circle, explaining it's not all doomsday ahead. So
I agree. I mean, we've talked about this, and you've heard me talk about this, but China, as an example, so much potential coming from China. And there was news today that was not great out of China, that their NDC, their nationally determined contribution, look at me using language that nobody else will understand. China put forth what their goals are in terms of energy production, and it wasn't as great as we hoped it would be. That came out today. They said something like they want, I think it's about 10% reduction in emissions by 2035, when we were hoping for something more than that. But still, China, after the U.S. pulled out of Paris this time, China announced so many new renewable energy projects. They can produce solar panels and produce batteries and produce electric cars at a far cheaper rate than the U.S. can. China has some of the most broad and robust trade routes in the world. They are building out renewable energy infrastructure in developing countries, in places where we can actually skip over oil and gas infrastructure, skip over coal infrastructure. So now we have a path to industrialization for a lot of these countries that will not require going through the same systems that the US has gone through, that China has gone through, that India has gone through. I make this claim sometimes. I think I talked about it when I gave the graduation speech in June. But honestly, for the world as a whole, the U.S. pulling out of Paris is not a bad thing, because it allows other countries to step up in a much bigger way than they ever would have before, instead of just taking guidance from the U.S. And the biggest thing that the U.S. has ever done on climate is the Inflation Reduction Act. Really great. We should absolutely be celebrating it. But what the Inflation Reduction Act really is a set of incentives for business and individuals to do more around climate. That's not collective action. That's not systemic change. It put in a bunch of money to build out new infrastructure, to create new solar, to build new energy. It's not changing the policies. And the way that the Trump administration is really just going full force in terms of policies, when we have a Democratic president next, that is the approach we should be using in order to build, a transmission line. I was talking with a bunch of people who are working in the energy sector, and we said the best thing to come out of the Trump administration, which would absolutely stroke his ego, is why not build the big, beautiful Trump transmission line across America?
We definitely need transmission.
Yeah,
so,
just put his name on it. Who cares?
That's good.
We just need transmission. Let's do it. Let's stroke his ego. Who cares?
Well, this raises an important question for either one of you to answer. Is how do you persuade the private sector to invest in climate solutions, if the financial incentives aren't immediately apparent?
So I did a sabbatical actually at a venture capital firm that has a commitment.
It's not the place people usually choose for sabbaticals.
I like to dabble.
Okay.
Let's just say that. But it was a venture capital firm with a commitment to investing in companies that could have significant potential to mitigate climate change. What was interesting about it was they, one could argue, they were doing this for the good of the planet, the good of the humans on the planet, but they, in an altruistic fashion, but they wanted to make money, right?
Yeah.
So they really were looking at both the positive outcomes from a climate mitigation standpoint, but also the financial returns, and they were not going to invest in something that they knew weren't going to have the returns. It didn't take a climate scientist to convince them of that. But what they also did was says we are not going to invest in a company unless at scale it could save 0.5 gigaton of carbon a year, which is a pretty big amount. On average, it's about 50 gigatons CO2 equivalent, 50 plus globally that gets emitted. So 0.5 gigaton from one technology, one company coming out is
huge.
A lot.
Yeah.
So being able to kind of have that dual purpose, right, there's interest in investing for those reasons. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Any other examples from you, Adam?
Yeah. It's funny, backstage we were talking about the idea of a private company versus a public company and having shareholders versus not having shareholders. I think that the companies that don't have shareholders can run towards this like nothing before, right? When they don't have to have people voting on things and don't have a board in that same way.
And quarterly
reports.
expectations.
Yep.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think companies that do have shareholders and these quarterly expectations have this opportunity to speak in front of the world that a lot of private companies don't, by having these quarterly calls, by having these CEOs be very public. They have a real opportunity to set an example and use their own rhetoric in order to make sure their supply chains are decarbonizing. In general, I'm not a big fan of bullying, but in this instance, I love bullying because somebody like Apple, right, and even somebody like IKEA, like we were talking about, they effectively say, if you want to be some of our suppliers, you need to be sustainable. You need to use renewable energy. That's bullying, but that's, we can talk about that later. That's absolutely something they should be doing. But even more than that at this time, and not to get too political, companies, especially international, multinational companies, are the most powerful forces on the planet right now. And I'm not talking about dismantling capitalism. I am talking about them using their rhetoric to preserve the essence of democracy. Because that is the only way we are going to end up preserving democracy in here. We are fearful of losing it in Europe. We are fearful of using it around the world. These companies, when banding together, have more power than governments around the world because they are responsible to the people, they are responsible to their shareholders, and they are not responsible to governments. Somebody was talking to me about the tariff system. I was talking to some World Bank people, and they were saying, like, okay, even if the U.S. really messes up, trade for the U.S., that really accounts for 18 to 20% of trade in the world. Yes, that's a large number, but it's also not crazy catastrophic. If we really mess things, Trump is not going to do anything that is going to close the U.S. off from the rest of the world and us not to be able to get any goods from anywhere else. So even if he did that, it would be about 20%. That other 80%, that's more than enough for a revolution, right? There's a lot of social science that says you need about 3.9% of a population to get engaged in order to actually push back against an authoritarian government.
3.9?
3.9% of a population.
That's not a lot.
It's not a lot. But those people need to be hyper-engaged. They need to be marching in the streets. They need to be galvanizing people to vote. They need to do walkouts. They need to do strikes. They need to do all of that kind of thing. But 3.9% is not very much. 80% of the world, that is plenty in order to make sure we have our democratic institutions intact. And we're never going to solve the climate crisis unless we have those institutions intact.
You are full of silver linings today.
Let's go. Yeah. It's the end of Climate Week. Come on. We got to be a little unhinged.
I want to. There's one thing that I'd like you to talk about, if only briefly, because I'd asked Alexis about navigating conflict.
Yep.
And many of you may not know, but you sat down with Glenn Beck for 4 hours.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that and where you ended up.
Do we know who Glenn Beck is? Show of hands. Okay, only about half. Glenn Beck, think the last generation's Tucker Carlson. So, Fox News commentator, kind of after Rush Limbaugh broke down the idea of what independent news is, which doesn't really exist on that network. He's not on Fox anymore. Started out on CNN, blah, blah, blah. I could not disagree more with this man on 99.95% of issues. We literally disagree on everything. And he came to one of our shows a couple of years ago, and he tweeted after the show and said, I love AJR, I love their lyrics, I love their music, love their performance. And then he wrote something else I'll tell you about in a second, but I was thinking about it, and I was like, our lyrics are so lefty. We talk about, immigration and wanting to have a female president and all of these things. We even talk about quinoa, which is the most lefty of all the grains. And then the second part of his tweet was, I like them because AJR really helped me to connect with my son. So then I started to think about that. And then I wrote to him when I was working on this book, asking him if I can interview him. And then in the book, there's a chapter about bringing together unlikely allies, building a bigger tent. So I sat down with him for 4 hours. My goal in these 4 hours was to find one thing that we could agree on. Literally one thing. That was my goal. And we spent 4 hours together. We talked about LGBTQ rights. Could not find overlap there. We talked about religion. Could not find overlap. Like, we talked about everything you can imagine. We talked about climate, and he knew everything that I was doing. Could not find overlap. Towards the end of these 4 hours, so I'm talking to him about his house that he has somewhere in the West. I think it's Montana. And he goes, my house is completely sustainable. You're going to be so happy. You know, we have solar and we use natural gas. And I was like, oh, use natural gas. You know, that's sustainable? And he said, yeah, natural gas is completely clean. And I said, who told you that? And he said, everybody knows that. And I was like, oh, amazing answer. Love that answer. And then I went on to explain to him how natural gas is primarily methane, and it's about, 80, depending on who you ask about, 87 times more heat trapping than CO2. It lasts a lot less time in the atmosphere. It's one of the best, fastest solutions we have to climate change. And we found one thing to agree on, and that one thing is plugging leaks in methane gas pipelines because of the business case. And sometimes you just need to speak to people in the language that they understand. That will actually have a huge impact on climate if we can plug those methane gas pipelines. That contributes a huge amount to warming. And it warmed my heart
Yes.
to know that we found one thing to agree on.
Now, NASA does a lot of the funding around, has done a lot of the funding around data, gathering data, satellites that need to get launched to visualize how much methane leaks there are. There have been some private companies as well to engage in that, so that's good. So hopefully we can continue that conversation with many others that see the business case and continue to be able to capture some of those leaks. So.
Can you give, this is a question from the audience, can you give examples of more accessible climate change language you recommend using?
Sure. So in this neo-industrial revolution, we outline it, how it should be used in each of these sectors. And again, this is not all of the solutions. This is just like a philosophy for moving forward. Climate change really is, and I think I said this before, climate change is how we get from place to place. It's how we build things. It's how we grow things. It's what happens when we flip a switch. The mother that I was talking about before, I met this mother in Detroit, and the thing that she cared about was making sure that the school buses, which had a history of breaking down, didn't break down. That's what she was worried about day to day, that she wouldn't be able to get her kids to and from school because these old combustion engine school buses were just breaking down. The ability to switch to electric for a school bus is a decision that is made at the community level. It's a decision that's made at the local level. This mother does not care about climate change. She cares about having reliable school buses. And that is going to come from electrifying the school bus fleet. Same thing about getting food on people's plate. That is a climate issue. We in the room can talk about that as a climate issue. We at Climate Week can talk about it as a climate issue. With some scientists, we can talk about that as a climate issue. But for most people, they want to know they can get something cheap and healthy. And in more often than not, that comes from growing something hyper locally. That is a climate issue that we can solve. And people want to know that my community grew these carrots. My community has employed people, the economics are better in my community, and I know it's safe because it's coming from right near me and it wasn't frozen and shipped across the world in order to get to me. That's healthy, that creates good paying jobs, and that is climate change. But don't tell them that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it depends who you're talking to and what the issue is, obviously. So, one that comes to mind is around pollution. And sometimes pollution is a word people understand better. It is a word people understand better than climate change. And so if you think of some of the impacts of burning fossil fuels and what that has shown to do in terms of asthma rates in certain denser populations in urban areas, right? So if you're talking about with parents who have children who have asthma and they realize this linkage between, that power plant over there and, oh my goodness, so many people in my children's classroom have asthma, right? That linkage. So you talk about human health and pollution, right? You can use it from that perspective. Or sometimes I talk to people that are not really interested in climate change mitigation, but they are interested in energy independence. Maybe even for themselves too. So they like the idea of being off-grid or having some control over when they're using their energy, and so they'll put solar on their roof and a battery to have more control when power goes out, or more control because they want to live in a place that doesn't have access to electricity. So again, it might not be for sort of climate change mitigation reasons, but for other reasons. So I think it's about finding, like Adam is saying, meeting people where they are.
This actually invites reading of a question. I didn't know anything about this. What are either of your thoughts on the solar punk movement and its possibility for the near future?
I don't know what the solar punk movement is.
No idea.
Who's the solar
Does
punk?
anybody know?
Don't be shy, Solar Park. Oh, that's you. Okay. There's a microphone right there if you wouldn't mind stepping over there and telling us about the solar punk movement.
I was sure you would know, Adam.
I have no clue. I feel like I could make up something funny, but
Okay, so I think Google can do a better job of summarizing it.
I thought you knew.
No. Okay. It's a long story, but there was a Chobani ad that was very artfully done. So I was like, wait, what is this? And then it's solar punk. So it's a speculative fiction subgenre, an art movement that imagines a future where society and technology coexist with nature in a sustainable and egalitarian way. So
That's lovely.
yeah, as like I'm a quantum physics major, so like I love the idea of like science and like technology and building things that grow with nature and like keep things real. But yeah, like I guess what are your thoughts on like the possibility of that? Because like things like big companies, it's like hard to like keep nature in mind and like keep the earth and the
So it's about truly integrating tech and nature with a utopian ideal.
yes.
Easy.
Do you have an? I'm happy to go.
I mean, it's a beautiful concept.
Agreed.
I think if I were to think about the far future, perhaps that is actually where we will end up as society, as we start realizing the importance of all these other aspects about the planet and the impact that it has on our everyday life and our generational lives. So I think today, in the real world, right, it's a little bit harder to do that without, from a business perspective, making the business case, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Two things. I think that some people in the climate movement are deeply anti-capitalist, and I think that's a fair assessment, but I think it's an unrealistic assessment to completely dismantle capitalism before we've solved climate change. That is just absolutely never going to happen. And to answer your question, I think the most viable place for this to be a reality is to be done by companies themselves. We see a lot of campuses and small cities being built by companies now. And even if you think big tech like Amazon and Apple, they build out these mini cities around the world. That's where the opportunity is to build society like this. And even if it just happens for part of the day when people are at the office, to integrate tech and business and nature together, they can do it much faster than anybody else can, and they have the resources to do it, and they also set examples for a lot of other places. So I think if I were to develop a campaign around this, it would be to push companies to take their home bases, their campuses that they're building around the world, and build it using this model. And then if the people who work at these companies say, oh, this is a great environment, this is where I want to be living and doing more things, then you can replicate it in small towns across the world, and then it can grow. But I think that's probably the most viable place for this movement to really catch on, is, funny enough, inside the capitalist movement.
Mm.
The discussion of climate advocacy and mitigating climate change brings up the idea of immigration, because we're going to have so many climate refugees. And when you're just talking about big tech companies building small cities, one idea that I've heard mentioned very casually and without much information is, why don't we have open borders? We have these vast swaths of land, be they fertile or not. And I wonder, are there any movements that are at least climate advocacy adjacent about looking at what it would look like to build cities from scratch with climate refugees, with, you know, if we were to live in have open borders? Have you heard of anything like that?
I haven't heard of anything like that specifically, but there are models for building really quickly. And the best example I can think of is a place like Dubai or a place like Qatar, right? If you think about those places, about 40 years ago, it looked nothing like it does today. Those are some of the most advanced in terms of construction and even sustainable materials. Yes, they are petrostates. Qatar is one of the largest producers of natural gas. But if you think about how quickly they were able to go from living in a mixture of tents and clay buildings and fabric-based buildings to what they have today, that is the fastest growth that I can think of in history, right? That's the fastest transition. So that gives me a lot of hope. Now, climate refugees, as we know, are going to be the largest form of immigration over the next decade. I think there is a real opportunity in places around the world to build society from the ground up using the model of Qatar and using the model of Dubai and the UAE. But I'm not sure of any specific examples of places that are built with migrants in mind that incorporate sustainability. Are you familiar with any?
No, but I will say at the climate school, a big focus of many of our faculty and researchers is on migration and understanding migration, understanding what areas are most vulnerable. We actually run a conference every other year here focused on migration due to the climate crisis. So you know, even so there's a lot of efforts to look at where that's happening, why it's happening, and how to maybe mitigate the negative impacts of it.
One of the things that you hear, I guess you could call it a delusion that's often bandied about, is that, oh, big tech is going to rescue us from climate change. Let's still, we keep driving, driving big SUVs and everything's going to be fine. Someone will come to the rescue. I'm fascinated by some of these concepts, be they far-fetched or more realistic. Could you tell us about some of them?
Well, what you've got up here, I think, is geoengineering to some extent. Yeah, so this is the concept that can we as humans, we've already intervened with how the planet works. So can we further intervene to minimize the warming effect, essentially, and some of the weather-related impacts of climate change? There are a slew of ideas out there that have been proposed. One that's probably the most popular is can we sort of seed the clouds in a certain way, distribute particles into the atmosphere that change the dynamics of cloud formation? Clouds play an incredibly critical role in impacting how the planet ultimately warms, and the water cycles and various other aspects of the climate science that influences our extreme weather events and things like that. So can we sort of seed the atmosphere in such a way that we change the cloud formation, or that we reflect more of the sun's rays right back into space, so they're not as much coming down to Earth. That's another way to do it. These are all very sort of scary ideas. I am not necessarily a proponent of them. I don't think it's...
Me neither.
I don't think that this is like we should put all our eggs in that basket. I do, as a scientist, I do say, sure, let's do some research on that. Responsible research should be done to investigate this. Maybe there is a holy grail out there. I don't know. I seriously doubt it. But let's do some of the scientific research on it. I will say there's a couple ideas that might sound a little less scary. One has to do with essentially storing carbon in rock formation. So there are many natural sinks, right? Even forests, for example, where carbon can get stored. The problem, quote unquote, with a tree is the tree will eventually die over usually decades and decay, and that's natural part of how this all works. Rocks that store carbon can do so for hundreds, thousands of years and even longer. And so there's some research out there to look at, can we sort of roughen the rocks, to make a long story short, in order to store more carbon in rock formations and therefore reduce the amount of emissions in the atmosphere. So again, I think these are all viable things to look at, but I am not confident that there's a good path forward. Obviously, a lot of geopolitical issues with this too that would get in the way.
Yeah. Okay. I would be curious to know just about some of the tech that you are working on at the climate school. What are we looking at right here?
Sure. I'm not sure what we're looking at right here, but it looks a little scary. But I will say a lot of the work that we're doing is on looking at extreme weather events. So we have scientists at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, part of the climate school, that look at flooding and tropical storms and hurricanes and even earthquakes. And they're trying to understand the Earth in a much deeper way, because the better understanding we have of the Earth and the weather events surrounding what's happening on Earth, the better prepared we can be to mitigate the effects of climate change. So lots of great science going on there. And then lots of work then more on, I'll call it the impact side, to say, what can we do? Are there technologies out there or policies out there that then help us deal with extreme flooding, for example? You can imagine, and we've seen many of this over the decades, different technologies that are available to try and protect part of where humans are, where ecosystems are, from the negative impacts of flooding. And then policies put in place to help as well. Make sure we're not building dams where we shouldn't build them, right? Where we have flooding, we just put it in a different area than it was originally going to go naturally. And so we put policies in place to do that too. So lots of our faculty and researchers working on sort of how to get those technologies and policies out there.
I mean, like, we're looking at this dystopian picture of Lower Manhattan here.
Yeah.
One thing I'd heard is, like, if you built a seawall around, the deep-pocketed neighborhoods, financial district, Tribeca, wouldn't it just offset, wouldn't a wave hit that and then go to poor neighborhoods over in Queens?
Exactly.
How do you avoid that?
That's right. So this is... Right, these are not simple problems to solve. From a scientific perspective, from a social science perspective as well. So if whatever solutions that we think we have, we need to model them and analyze them and run testing. And that's what a lot of our folks are doing, to understand, if you put the wall in Lower Manhattan, where does the water then go? That has to be part of the analysis that we do. And it is.
And Adam, your degree is in human rights law, PhD.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that intersection between climate advocacy and human rights law.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, this picture, I pitched an idea to the Biden administration that he should go stand in different places around the U.S., and we should Photoshop in where the sea level rise would be, like around him, like him giving one talk and then cutting to this place and cutting to this place.
Like in 2050 or 20, like...
Or, yeah, but in 2030 and
In
then
2030.
2040
Oh,
and
okay.
2050,
I
like
like that.
standing
I
in the
like
middle
that.
of Central Park, standing in front of the White House, standing like in Florida and in Miami, and he would be like fully underwater. And I thought that would just be a really like interesting comm strategy, but that's why I like that picture. They put. So my research was looking at indigenous and local communities in places around the world and developing a strategy for these communities to own renewable energy projects around the world. And so many renewable energy projects are using still the same methodology of building as historical oil, gas, coal, et cetera. And so what I did was I worked on projects in Bangladesh, in Kenya, and in Canada, and developed a model for ownership over these projects. And I'll give you one example. In Canada, there's a First Nation in Ontario called the Okikendawat First Nation. And what they did was, because of the way the rights worked, they were able to interview all of these different hydroelectric companies because they had, a river running through their land. And they were losing band members. They were losing members of their community left and right because young people wanted to go to Toronto and Montreal to go to school. So what they did was they interviewed all of these different companies, and they found one that was willing to let them keep a certain percentage of the ownership. They kept 40%. This local community kept 40% ownership over this hydroelectric plant. And they embedded into the contract the human rights obligations that Canada was going to end up protecting, including economic, social, and cultural rights. One in particular that I found interesting was that turtles were vitally important to them. And so they built into the contract with the company that anytime there was a turtle on site during construction, all construction needed to pause. They needed to take the turtle, move it off site, and then they could continue construction. Like, that's one specific example, but we used this idea as a model in order to build human rights obligations from the ground up into new renewable energy development. Because that industry still is relatively nascent. Yes, we're far along, but it's still relatively nascent compared to oil and gas. So now is the time to instill a new business ethics from the beginning. So that was my passion, and I started it a long time before, human rights and climate really became this merged field around environmental justice. And so I ended up working with a handful of companies in order to instill this.
Okay. We've got time for one more question.
Great.
And this is what's probably burning for most. Curious regarding your thoughts on the conundrum of, one, AI possibly helping us unlock insights to accelerate climate solutions versus, two, AI's outsized energy consumption. So just let's hit the AI one in general, because I think a lot of people are curious about that.
Want me to go first? I
Sure.
don't know if we're going to agree on this one. We'll see.
Let's see what happens. I love a spicy moment.
I don't know. I'm super excited about AI and its positive impact on energy, and I'll take it from both sides, as you point out, Matt. So there are many systems that need changing to address climate change, right? It's a system level problem. We're not so good as humans, at least we haven't been, as doing system level problems. We like to think kind of in buckets. And this is exactly what AI is good at. So I'll give you an example. I work on building energy efficiency. The buildings are pretty dumb. They really haven't, the intelligence in buildings really hasn't changed in decades. Why? It's not that we don't have the solutions. It's just that, well, we've got heating and cooling and lighting. We've got to deal with the fact that people open and close doors. People like thermostats at different temperatures. And we don't know how to integrate sort of human preferences and building intelligence and controls and sensing and all that data together to kind of come up with a solution that helps us reduce the energy consumption in buildings. So what artificial intelligence will help us do, what it is helping us do, is essentially you just think of it as sophisticated control or monitoring, sensing, taking that data and making intelligent choices about what to do in your office versus my office in this building, how to better control the fact that it's actually quite cold in here. We probably almost all of us want it to be a little bit warmer, right? And through that sensing and data analytics, be able to better control these systems and lead to reduction in energy. Another good example is I talk to companies that run manufacturing lines all the time. They're constantly trying to improve their manufacturing. It's a bottom line issue for them. And through various implementation of better modeling, better analytics, better sensing of the manufacturing line, the electrical pieces, the mechanical pieces, the human behavior pieces, they're able to more efficiently run that. So as a result, we will see energy consumption go down. We will see improved energy efficiency from AI. On the data center piece, and I was just on a panel about this yesterday, right? We are going to see a boom in data centers. I think we all know that as a result of needing to process AI and computations at a much faster speed in much bigger ways. But already we're seeing, if you compare a year ago or 2 years ago to today, much more efficient AI processing the algorithms much more than we have before. We've seen this kind of technology advancement in the past. We've seen it with the number of transistors that you can pack on a chip, right? We've seen it even in refrigerators, one of my favorite. The efficiency of refrigerators has gotten so much better than since the 1970s. We're going to see that kind of innovation in computational processing, in the efficiency of it, and that will reduce our energy consumption per compute, per sort of query, if you will. And again, there's some evidence out there from scientists and engineers, from some of the big hyperscaler companies out there, that's showing that this is already happening. So our consumption is going to increase overall. I'm not trying to argue that, but the efficiency that we'll be able to process will also increase, and at the same time, we're going to get energy efficiency enhancements across a variety of other sectors. So I don't know. How do you feel about it, Adam?
I agree with every single thing that you said.
Wow, okay. There we go.
I'll add one more tiny point. The incentives for building new energy projects and new transmission is going to come from scaling everything that you just said. Because even if climate and energy is a partisan problem, this is not as much a partisan problem. And in order to achieve this, we are going to need more of that. So it will actually help our energy problem.
I agree. A little point I like to make is efficiency's been around for a long time. Maybe some of you grew up in places where there are demand response programs you could participate in, or you walk into a store to buy a new refrigerator, you can buy the more energy efficient one. It's been hard to get those off the ground because electricity has just not been valued as much. I'm not just talking about price, I'm talking about the value of electricity is now going up because of AI. And to Adam's point exactly, I think because we're going to value electricity more, energy efficiency programs that utilities are running, things like that will become more attractive to everybody. And I'm really hoping, I'm very hopeful, that we'll see a real uptick in energy efficiency across a variety of different technologies and programs.
Okay. In closing, I'd like to ask you both to offer thoughts for our listening audience and our audience here. How do you cultivate and sustain optimism?
Drugs.
Adam!
Hey, that's not okay, but you said we could curse? Do you want to go first?
I do. I think,
please.
It is something we do try to do as much as possible here at the Climate School.
Drugs.
Not drugs. Optimism, Matt.
Right.
I think it's really hard. I talk to students, it's about mid-year when they're like feeling depressed because they're learning in their courses all that's wrong with the world. And while we have some ideas around solutions, there's no silver bullet. And so we have to find ways to stay optimistic. I love this Venn diagram and remind ourselves why we're in it. Remind ourselves the joy that lies ahead. I loved Adam's suggestion about find some relatively small thing that you can see success in a relatively short amount of time. I love that. But I also feel like there's so many examples of positive aspects of what people like our students are doing out there in the real world. And you have to find them, but things along the lines of programs that are out there that are having an impact to mitigate the effects of climate change, around the fact that just look at the cost of solar compared to natural gas every day when you wake up, and be happy that it's so cheap to actually do renewable energy today. And so just constantly looking at those bits of information out there that help motivate us to move forward and to have the inertia to keep going.
Nice. If you look around this room, every single thing that you see is related to climate. Everything you're wearing, all of the materials that this building was built out of, like we were talking about the temperature in this room, obviously the ideas that are flowing around, every single thing is related to climate. I like the idea of thinking about it as you wake up in the morning. I think that's a thing, because when I wake up in the morning, I think about what I want to achieve that day, what is going to make me happy, the kinds of things that are on this Venn diagram. And then I come to realize that almost anything I could possibly do during that day, anything I could possibly work on, is climate. Because climate really is everything. And to more fundamentally answer your question that I didn't answer like an hour ago, is that whether you're studying political science or health or art or hard sciences or law, anything that you're studying, anything that you're working on can actually be applied to climate, because it really just is everything. So I don't think that we should be thinking about, how can we stay optimistic in working in climate? Because I think we need to be moving away from this idea of working in climate. And I was asked yesterday about, are we afraid that the movement is going to become more diffuse? And the answer is, I'm not afraid of that. I'm hopeful for that. The movement is too big and too broad and doesn't really mean anything. I'd much rather there was a much more specific and targeted movement of people really passionate about farming, people really passionate about construction. I don't know who's passionate about zoning, but people really passionate about zoning, about transportation. Those movements will be so much more powerful than people marching in the street saying climate change, right? And I think the optimism is going to come from, yes, the wins in the small places, but the optimism comes from people doing what they love. Almost nobody in the world actually does climate change work. They do stuff that's really specific, really local, something that they studied in school or not, and that's how we're actually going to solve this problem. And so the solution and the optimism go hand in hand because they need to be real. Our lack of optimism in this movement comes from the things we're trying to do being up here and not down here in the real world.
Thank you. Folks, please help me give it up for Adam Met and Alexis Abramson.
You can learn more about Adam's climate work at planetreimagined.com. Stay up to date with his band at AJRbrothers.com, and be sure to check out his book Amplify wherever books are sold. To find out more about Alexis and the Columbia Climate School, please visit climate.columbia.edu. Sing for Science is co-produced by Talkhouse and made possible in part by a grant from the Simons Foundation. Our music is by Panoram. Social media manager and video editor is Bailey Constas. Location recording was provided by the Forum's AV team, and our digital producer is Keenan Cush. Special thanks to Jennifer Genrich, Josephine Parr, Kim Millian, Alexa Price, and John Lawson for making today's episode possible. If you like Sing for Science, the best way you can support us is to give us a review, tell a friend about the show, and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. For more information, please visit singforscience.org and follow us on social media @SingForScience. Thanks for listening.